Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to this session. I'm chairing the session, and you've got a great panel of speakers here. I'm going to ask to introduce themselves in a second. My name is Matthew Durdy, Chief Business Officer of the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult, and we have a strong interest in gene therapy. But I'm not going to be doing the talking. These guys are. I'll ask you just now to introduce yourselves, just in terms of name, company, and your job title. We'll get back to the more detail later.
Good afternoon, everybody. Sven, Kili, and I head up the Cell and Gene Therapy Development Group as part of Rare Diseases for GSK.
Gilly, CEO of GenSight Biologics.
Silvia Priori, I'm a clinical scientist working in gene therapy at the University of Pavia.
Nicolas Koebel, Senior Vice President for Business Operations at Orchard Therapeutics.
I'm Iron Man. I'm Tim Miller. I'm the President and CEO of Abeona Therapeutics. Trying to get the panel to get a little energy in the crowd out here. So icebreaker.
Part of my job, the last part of my job is to look after the business and the strategy of the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult. So I love these sessions because there's a chance for me to ask a whole load of questions and get a whole load of information from a bunch of experts. But actually, it'll be a hell of a lot better if it's a group effort. So I'll ask you to start thinking about some of the questions you might want to ask as we go through the session. And if you've got a question, put your hand up. We'll try and get to you as quickly as we can. I may marshal it and bring it back to another time at the end, but we'll see what happens with that. We're going to go through 5 or 6 different topics. We're going to start with looking at how big is this industry as a whole, what's it likely to become. We'll look at some of the practicalities of the clinical stage of gene therapy development. We'll then go into what else you should be doing at the same time, because the clinical stage may not be sufficient by itself. We'll touch on the ever favourite of payment for gene and cell therapies in the future. And then we'll move on to looking forwards to what's coming through in terms of the pipeline. And I stress, please dive in with questions as soon as you can. So I'd like to start with that first area. How big is this industry? Where is it going? Is it just a niche industry, or is it really a whole new development for the future? And I'd like Nicolas to kick off with that. If you could give a little brief introduction to yourself and your company, and then a long session on what the, not too long.
Very good.
On that area. Thank you.
Okay, so Orchard Therapeutics is a late-stage biotechnology company. We're entirely focused on ex vivo lentiviral gene therapy, and we operate in 2 franchises. One of them is primary immune deficiencies, and the other one is inherited metabolic disorders. In the first franchise, primary immune deficiencies, our lead program is in a very rare disease of the immune system called ADA-SCID. In this disease, we have an ongoing clinical program with data in over 40 patients, evidence of survival, 100% survival, and evidence of immune reconstitution, and the safety profile is very supportive. So this is our lead program, and we work very hard to progress towards a file. And in the other franchise, inherited metabolic disorders, our lead program is in a disease called Sanfilippo type A, which Tim is also working in.
I think I've heard of it.
And so in that indication, we have a preclinical program, and we look to transition into the clinic. So that's the company. So to address your question, Matthew, how big is the industry going to be? In a former life, when I was working with GSK, I was in charge of producing forecasts, and one of the things that I've learned is always provide a range, because the forecasts are always wrong. So I don't know if this industry is going to be a $5 billion industry or $50 billion industry. Who knows, right? But the one thing you need to get right are the underlying assumptions for the forecast. And if you consider a number of facts, for gene therapy as a field, in aggregate, it's reasonable to assume it's going to be a very significant industry. And what are the facts? They have been more than 2,000 trials with gene therapy. The number of INDs has been increasing in recent years. I think last year there were over 80 INDs. And all of these efforts have actually delivered successful proof of concepts in the clinic, in a range of indications, in eye indications, in indications of the immune system, in metabolic indications, in neurodegenerative indications, etc. So across the board, quite an impressive set of data in the clinic. And some of that data suggests that gene therapy could displace existing treatment modalities. And meanwhile, the investment has been very significant. More than $10 billion for sure. And I think Informa estimated that last year alone, more than $5 billion have been invested in gene therapy. And that investment has yet to pay off, but at least there is a belief that these therapies will lead to approved and successful medicines. So in aggregate, I would argue it's reasonable to assume it's going to be a very significant industry.
Does everybody else agree with that? Sven, is that?
Yeah, Matthew, I do. I don't think any of us would be here if we didn't agree with it. I think this is really, we look at this at GSK, we tend to look at cell and gene therapy as kind of the third pillar in therapeutics. So we've got small molecules, large molecules, and now the brave new frontier, which is cell and gene therapy. And I really see this is a brand new way to look at disease and a brand new way to look at being able to treat and in many cases actually cure disease. And I think that's something that's phenomenally exciting. We've never been able to do that before. It's always been about treating the symptoms, treating the sequelae, but it's never really been about getting down to the cause of that disease and being able to treat it. And I think for the first time, we're starting to get to the point of that convergence where science is starting to understand what that real molecular cause and genetic cause is, and our technology is getting us there to be able to make a difference and to actually change that and hopefully provide a cure to patients. So I think from that, following on, can only be something that is going to be very successful and I think is going to change the way we treat patients in the coming years.
Anybody else want to add anything to that? So let me chuck in a question then, that's sort of on the minds of people I speak to. So at the moment, the indications are very clear, the logical application of the gene therapy to a particular genetic disorder. How wide can it go within healthcare? I mean, are we talking about getting onto chronic diseases and the likes effectively, or is it really always going to be facing these areas of extremely high unmet need?
Well, I'm not from GSK, so maybe I cannot answer. No, I think it really comes to a number of further development that still needs to be done, right? I mean, the CRISPR is coming in, and it's not yet there, but I mean, there's very good progress that are being made. So yes, indeed, I mean, it could apply probably to a wider range of disorders. But I think not only is it going to be great in terms of the size of the industry, it's also changing the industry. It's changing the paradigm, in a scientific paradigm, tackling to the disease, exactly as you said. I mean, we're now trying to tackle the root cause of the disease, which is sort of brand new. I mean, brand new for the last 15 years, maybe 20 years, right? But also it is going to change the way people are going to pay for the medicine. I mean, we are going to enter in a world where we may have the situation where we're curing the disease. Okay, one treatment. I don't know, and that remains also to be confirmed. But I mean, and only time will tell the truth here. How long will be the expression? Is that going to be for life? And then yes, that will be a big change. We're curing it. One injection, done. So I mean, how well this is going to be received by the payers, by all the stakeholders in the industry remains to be seen. But at least that is going to change this.
Okay, good. Any other comments on this area?
Yeah, just you mentioned the acquired diseases, whether it's successful in the monogenic, maybe not in others. I think that the challenge when gene therapy has been attempted in acquired diseases is the fact that it's uncommon to think of a single target. So the application will have to revisit different parameters where you go to silence or to activate a pathway, and that probably will be a cluster of genes. And so this goes back to the issue of how large the insert should be and these other factors. But so right now seems very challenging. In the future, might even get there. A
natural evolution of where we are today. Good, good. Let's move on to another subject then, since Silvia's speaking. The practicalities, so the title of the session is the clinical progress of gene therapies. Is it the same as every other industry, or are there some special advantages or disadvantages or anything within the gene therapy industry? Silvia, again, if you could introduce yourself in a bit more detail and your institution, and then talk about the subject of the development stage.
Thank you. I'm a cardiologist and I work in inherited arrhythmias, meaning diseases that cause sudden cardiac death in young people. Sometimes you hear athletes dying suddenly for unexplained reason with a normal heart, and often these people have these kind of diseases. So we have a very large population of patients with several of these conditions, 7 or 8 different diseases. And we have started 5 years ago to start thinking about gene therapy for these diseases, and starting from the recessive forms and now to the dominant forms. And the heart is definitely one of those organs that have not been really objective of a lot of gene therapy. So I think that there is a challenge in designing the most suitable approach for the heart gene therapy. So in terms of thinking of the future of gene therapy, I think that there is no question that in the treatment of patients with single gene diseases is a paradigm shift in the field or in the mind of the patients, and the patients associations and patients groups are already demanding this. And this is something unique of this industry, the heavy involvement of the patients, the willingness of the patients to be part of the scheme. So I think that this also requires, communicating expectations in the right perspective very early on to these patients groups. And the concept that just was mentioned, the potential curative approach is really the most attractive component. Even if it's not only one shot of injection for life, if you have to redo it beside the issue of immunity, if that is taken care, still represents such a change as compared to the life with multiple therapies or no option for these patients.
Anybody want to chip in there?
Yeah, I'd probably add that, one of the things that we're seeing right now is really the proof of concept is really, from an efficacy standpoint, is being seen in single gene autosomal recessive disorders. The challenges that gene therapy has faced in the past 2 years has been on gene therapies that have tried to go after, diseases that have multiple comorbidities, like some of the heart failure, trials. But the proof of concept there is now beginning to be seen in the autosomal recessive. So now you're going to, I think, where some of the space is going to branch out into is some of those other magic bullet approaches where, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, things where gene therapy now can get there, but it's going to be targeted.
So
I
how
would
do you
be
do that?
maybe more optimistic on the dominant one, because actually we are seeing that the field, is seeing that sometimes unexpectedly even a modest change in the amount of a protein or in the silencing of a protein can make a huge impact. And so that can be very positive in thinking about the dominant conditions as well.
Still single gene defect, though.
Still single gene
Still
defect.
single
I
gene.
completely agree on that.
I agree.
Yeah.
So what changes do we need to make in terms of the infrastructure for clinical development, if any, to move on to this next stage, to be able to actually be able to gather and analyse and create new therapies and then move them into the clinic with the cooperation of both the patients and the regulators?
Time.
Time? Is that it? Just
Time.
more work?
Money.
More
Well,
investment?
look at the hemophilia space, right? There are something like 7 companies working on hemophilia. Chances are, it's a relatively, compared to diseases with a CNS manifestation, it's easier to measure, right? How to determine something is efficacious, right? Chances are many of them are going to have some level of efficacy, and it's going to be years before we really know that which one won, So, there's just news coming out today, that looks at some of these companies that, extended duration of data, how long does that get you? But many of them will probably end up winning to some level of being able to demonstrate. But the question, I think, will be how long and, which one's going to have the best, longest profile.
And have we got that time? Have we got the funding to give us that time?
Oh, that's where you start getting into. I think you're going to start to see a lot more mergers and acquisitions from some of the big pharma companies taking in some of the smaller companies.
Yeah. But I would say the requirement for more time is probably going to apply equally to all players in the field. So I think individual companies will not, are not likely necessarily to be at a disadvantage against everything else. So the requirement for time, I think, will apply to a large extent to many companies. In the field of ex vivo gene therapy, and I invite Sven to comment. I think what is a challenge is implementing a global supply chain, that is scaled up and that meets, the requirements of regulators, and the kind of things that would help this field to move this field forward is, of course, automation, closed multi-step processes, to have validated assays for process validation and that thing. So to industrialize some of the enabling technologies that will allow the therapies to move forward to files.
Interesting. So that's a good point to bring you in.
Yeah,
So-
I think maybe if I could even take a couple of steps back, and I completely agree with Nicolas. I think, we're right at the beginning of this new therapeutic area. We're only, a short 15, maybe 20 years into it, and we're starting to gather pace. And I think if we talk about clinical development and developing these really cool genes and these really cool cells as medicines, I think we should take the time now just to take a step back and think, how do we develop them? If you think about the framework that we all address in terms of developing these therapies on a day-to-day basis, those frameworks are mostly around developing small molecules. Speak to the regulators, it's about looking at overdose, it's about looking at toxicities, it's dose finding, things like that. And if you go and speak to a regulator about an autologous product and you start discussing overdose, that becomes a really interesting discussion. And so I think this is our time to really take a step back and say, what is appropriate? What is relative to these cell and gene therapies that we're developing? What are the tests and the studies that we need to do that will teach us something? How much benefit are we getting from dosing a bunch of mice with human cells, even if they're humanized mice? How much are we really learning? What are the benefits potentially of looking at in silico models? Let's really take the time now to try and find a way of working more effectively, more efficiently, and then rapidly, and being able to get into humans in an appropriate, risk-driven way. And I think then we come to some of the discussions we've already heard today, is we're having potentially one therapy, one dose for the rest of a patient's life, or even one every year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. How do we develop those surrogates that we can go to the regulators with and give them the comfort that this therapy is actually doing what we said it would do? How can we learn to work more effectively? And then I think one of the other really, really key things is everybody talks about getting a product approved, and that's cool, and that's really amazing. But the fight and the real work starts is getting it reimbursed, getting the prescriptions written, getting the patients treated. And this is, I think, something that we need to start bringing in much, much earlier. We need to be starting to think about how do we create value from before the first time we dose a human. We should be thinking, what is the data that we need to collect? Who are we going up against? What are the therapies that are currently being used? And let's stop thinking just about what are the other tablets or the other large molecules that are being used, but what does it cost for this patient to undergo that therapy? Think about maybe a rare disease where kids only live to maybe 2 or 3 years old, and they may use up 250, 300,000 pounds worth of treatment in a couple of years. Think about those other costs, the readmissions after other therapies, things like that. Let's bring all of those things into that value argument and figure out how we create better value for the shareholders, for the patients, for the reimbursement agencies, and for the governments where we're developing these therapies. So let's really take the time to think about these things. And then part of that is exactly what Nicolas said, is how do we make these therapies available to patients? A lot of them have to be administered in a very controlled environment. How do we get it to them? What do the logistics networks need to look like? What are the regulatory hurdles that we're facing? What are the government hurdles about transporting cells across borders? Things like that. These are the kind of things we need to be thinking about now in order to compress the timelines, but yet come up with therapies that really reassure both the patients, the clinicians, the regulators, and the payers that this is really the way to go. So I would challenge everybody here today to just think about the area you work in and think, how can we do that better?
So picking up on that, and we'll come back to the question of the high-value drug and the payment mechanism in the next little session. But the question of really making sure that you've got this three-pronged development going on at the same time. You've got your clinical development, you've got your manufacturing and systems development, and then you've got your reimbursement development. I'd be interested to hear from each of the panelists that are developing drugs closer to the market how active they are in the other two areas besides the clinical development. What kinds of things, what kind of initiatives have you started that are preparing you for that acceleration towards the market? Tim?
I'll jump in, sure. So I think Nicolas touched on it. Manufacturing in gene therapy is the big issue that few companies have yet to solve. There are only 2 real manufacturers in the world that can make sufficient product right now, for commercial launch. You know, and you see many of the gene therapy companies in particular trying to develop their own manufacturing centers. You know, whether it's, you know, San Francisco or in Boston, Cleveland, although we lost just last night, and we don't want to talk about that. But, you know, but manufacturing is really the key thing in this space that, you know, you can demonstrate clinical efficacy, but to be able to come up with enough drug to be able to treat just 100 patients a year is a big challenge. And so, you know, from you know, Sven's perspective, I would probably take a little different shift, and I would say that, you know, demonstrate clinical efficacy, work out the manufacturing, and if it's working, someone's going to pay for it. You know, and you know, I mean, when 95% of these rare diseases don't have any cure, it's all palliative therapy.
Sure.
You know, this is all that they've got. You know, so working out pricing, and you can look at companies like Amicus or Ultragenyx. You know, they've worked out some of that pricing models for some of these rare diseases. Spark is another one that they're, you know, widely in the U.S. and thought to be one of the first ones that will come up with, you know, an approved therapy in the U.S. They're already having those discussions. You know, we get into and we're going to talk a little bit about paying and reimbursement right on the panel, but, you know, just as at least precursor to some of my thoughts, you know, it's going to be a different model for different disease categories. You know, and one model for all isn't going to work. And when you start looking at some of those issues from the payer's perspective, they've already said in some cases it will take too much energy we will have to recreate the entire healthcare system to be able to pay for the rare disease programs. It's easier for us to just write a check, okay, than have to come out and do an annuity based on some efficacy test that's going to happen over a 5-year period.
Interesting.
You know,
Well, we'll come on to that in a second. Let's just stick with the theme of the sort of co-development of the drugs, if you'd like. Nicolas or Bernard?
I agree with you to a large extent, Tim, because in indications where the unmet need is so enormous, right? There's a tremendous willingness from payers to make it happen, you know, and in some territories, that's right. Payers are not looking for complexity, right? They'd rather say they pay up front. In other territories, it's a bit harder, and you need to do more heavy lifting up front. So if there were 40 hours in a day, you would want to think about your reimbursement strategy even before you start the first clinical study. And perhaps it's just a matter of mindset and just spending a few hours with a payer expert and discussing the design of the study just to make a few tweaks. And maybe that 80-20 approach is maybe fit for purpose sometimes. But it's a big demand on small companies, right, to think about reimbursement when you're on the early stages of a clinical trial.
I just want to make a comment on the fact that the challenge for gene therapy to be reimbursed is to be really, really effective. You know, while in drugs you may tolerate an incremental efficacy on standard therapy, the gene therapy at the price that can be anticipated, even if not the highest one, but still is something that requires a very, very high change from the current therapy. And this is a difference from the rest of the industry that we need to keep in mind when we look at results and think what to bring to the clinics.
Yeah, there's no doubt that in the whole of our industry that you need a big force of efficacy to drive all of this change through, without a doubt. But we'll come on. Bernard, you're about to say something.
Well, just to respond to your first question, I think, what worries me more than the clinical results is really the access to the manufacturing for my commercial batches. Okay, we're terminating a phase 3. We'll probably be able to file next year. Early 2018. I'm not completely convinced that the CMO I'm using is going to be able to provide me with sufficient number of batches for commercialization, and that really keeps me awake. Because we have an enormous missing link here. You've seen. I was just saying before. I've seen probably, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 different vectors being proposed, being already in some clinical proof of concept. And these vectors would have to be produced for commercial batches. Who is going to produce this? So if you're lucky enough to get to the point that you got your BLA, that's fine. Maybe we can turn to the investors and say, hey guys, give me 30 millions. I'll invest in my own manufacturing suit. But before you get to this, we're really at risk. We're really at risk in the entire industry not to be able to get enough material to even cope with the number of existing clinical trials going on.
So, that's quite a scary thought, that the industry is dependent.
Speaking from the European perspective, right?
I agree, 100%.
Although one of our products is produced in Texas, but...
So is everybody just sitting there worrying about this problem? Or are any of you actually doing something about it? I mean, you can't just sit there and say, you know, there's no manufacturing, we're going to hit a wall. What plans have you got in place? How are you approaching it?
You got to pay someone to come up with your process, all right? And then you're basically going to have to, it's going to be cost effective once you have 2 programs to bring it in-house. So you do the cost analysis of, you know, how much it takes to have somebody do your PD work to commercialization, right? And then you essentially look at that point that says, well, it's going to cost us $20 million just to get to the point where you can get there. I can build out a facility, you know, for, you know, just a little bit more. And I mean, you're going to have to staff it, you know, and quality and validate it and everything else like that. But you know, there becomes a point where it doesn't make sense to bring it in. But you still need the process, you know, and that takes a year to 18 months.
So is there any comment from the floor on this? Because I was, you know, earlier on in the year, we were in California for the ARM conference, and I got the impression there that there was a flood of capacity coming through and that everything was going to be solved. Is it really still such a desperate issue? Is it?
There will be, I believe there will be new capacity coming in, but they're not yet ready now, and it will take at least 18 months to 2 years to get them to the point that they're ready to start manufacturing a lot of batches. So then the game is, can I buy a slot in 2 years now?
Yeah.
and pay quite a lot of money.
Again, we were living this, so I understand. I mean, it is, you know, it's scaling out,
Yeah.
right? There are 40-liter reactors. There are groups out there that can do this up to, you know, 40 liters. You're talking baculovirus production, you know. But when you're talking about trying to make, you know, 1 e to the 17th for a, you know, a commercial lot, or 2 e to the, you know, 18th, you know, for something even bigger. I mean, nobody can do that right now. You're talking multiple 400-liter at best, or at least, baculovirus type of production runs. So, sorry,
John,
we're getting a
you
little bit
did
into
it
the
at
details.
Oxford
mixed up
Biomedical.
here,
It's
but,
true, but it's really...
yeah, so.
John can comment. I mean, Oxford Biomedica has built their own facility, right?
Yeah,
So is everybody knocking your door down, John?
we have a lot of interest, and we have a lot of people talking to us. My Ph.D. guy, Peter Nolan, with that CBO, is working his socks off, keeping up there. But it takes time. You don't sign them every
Interesting.
day. Find
Yeah.
people, it takes time to get to the process, but we expect to sign more deals this year and next year.
I mean, as many people know, we're building a large manufacturing facility out in Stevenage, and actually there's a very strong interest in the facility from gene therapy companies who want to take control of their own process, and this, for me, this just adds to the sense of the urgency for them and the need for it.
It's very complicated. It's not
Sorry?
something you can just buy a building and make it work. It's very
No, absolutely, but they're developing their capabilities as well at the same time. Yeah. Keith.
Yeah. When I was talking about the Advanced Therapy Manufacturing Task Force, Steve cut me off with the last bit that I was going to talk about, and that was we made recommendations to government that they run a competition to get an industry partner to bid in to build additional viral vector manufacturing space, leveraging existing facilities. And that is probably one of the recommendations that will come through in this timescale. So, you know, there's a government action that would kind of help an industry sponsor move up, and both supplying the academic pipeline, which is what feeds everything, along with an industrial operator to facilitate company growth. So, and the additional, the one other thing on top of that, there'll be a collaborative R&D competition run for companies to bid in for collaborative R&D, which is non-dilutive, to develop technologies as well. So another example of the UK government kind of responding to the needs of industry to actually foster all of this.
Okay, so there's a message. Just keep your eye on what's going on in the UK on it. But, you know, it is an international problem.
You know, just one thing to make sure we do kind of put in perspective, these are the problems of success, right?
Yeah.
3 years ago, we would not even be having this conversation,
That's true.
right? So these are the problems of success. They're just the challenges that the space faces.
But, I mean, yeah, play devil's advocate. Two of you are in, there's quite a lot of overlap in terms of portfolios on this platform. You're in a race with each other. If one's got manufacturing capacity and the other one hasn't,
Yeah, I guess I'd probably say that, again, having worked with these families, we go back to, we're going to disappoint over the next 2 years. 95% of the families don't want to get into our trials, right? So right now, there's plenty of space for everybody to get in,
Sure.
and, more therapies, for these rare diseases is going to be better. So, patients are going to win.
Totally.
I think it's about getting the therapies out to the patients, and I think the therapies that work best will be the ones that will survive. And part of that will be the manufacturing, but it'll be the clinical outcomes and everything. And it's about making sure we get the therapies out and have choice for patients.
Yeah.
And so it's choice of patients. And you think in the case of the rare diseases, which to a large extent we're talking about here, that's just going to be down to clinical efficacy and supply? Or is there going to be a wraparound that goes with all of this of service?
I think
that
a
makes a difference.
lot of these therapies, it's about, we talk about the product is the process, and it's about getting that product out to the patient, being able to make the patient comfortable. These patients with rare diseases, it doesn't just affect the patient or the child, it affects the entire family. So it's being able to put sufficient resources in place to be able to make that family's life more bearable whilst the child or the patient, whoever it is going through that therapy, and then being able to work with the reimbursement agencies in order to be appropriately reimbursed and make it as smooth as possible. And then it's obviously, you have to have the
But that's
the
quite a lot of
efficacy.
infrastructure, isn't it, to deliver that?
It is.
And presumably, you're in a position where you can start building that now. Some of the smaller companies, you have to wait, I guess, and rely on others perhaps to build it for you. You guys?
I just wanted to support what Sven has been saying. I mean, autologous gene therapies are medicines that are used in the context of transplant. So we are not trying to create something new, but we embrace the existing system, and the kind of service that Sven is alluding to and that GSK is putting in place is a service to pediatric immunologists that treat patients in the context of a transplant. So we sort of embrace this existing system, and all the services are around an infrastructure and teams that already exist. So it's about finding out how you can marry the existing setup.
I just wanted to mention that in the problems related to success, is appearing also the problem of having multiple gene therapies for the same disease. And the uniqueness of our field is that if a patient takes one treatment, he will not be able to take the better one that is developed 2 years later, because if therapy is staying there, if the virus is residing in their cells, they will have no option for another therapy. So if these things are placed on the market at the same time, for the clinician in the world where these would be available or multiple trials are available, to tell one patient, would you like to join this one or that one, may be a big responsibility to take.
And how do you think that decision, let's say there is a choice there, how do you think that decision will be framed? What will they make the decision based upon?
Well, you can try to base it on the preclinical trials or the most effective promoter vector that is available, but it might not be that things happen exactly at the same time. One may be more advanced in development and the better one be just running up. And so how you handle that, and what the patient will say when they realize that they have received a therapy and 3 years later there is a better one, but it's no longer an option for them. I think that everything that changes, the way we are used to deal with drugs, facing these new therapies is something that we need to think, and start to handle and manage, and anticipate before the problem appears.
In these communities, news travel very fast. Patient advocacy groups are incredibly plugged in, and so information is going to travel at the speed of light between patients who are looking for treatments. And of course, to start with, there are, clinicians need to apply the enrollment criteria for the studies, and even two competing treatment approach in a disease do not necessarily have the same enrollment criteria. So that is one way to solve it.
Interesting. Yeah. Really interesting. Right, let's move on. Unless there are any questions from the floor, anybody? No? We'll keep going. Well, let's move on to the payment question then, right? So you're all spending millions and millions of dollars for limited patient populations, delivering enormous amounts of value. And there's a discussion at best, a battle at worst, coming around the question of payment. You all must have thought about it. Bernard, do you want to introduce the concept and tell us a little bit more about GenSight as well and
Sure.
some of the things that have to be tackled and dealt with now?
Sure. So just very briefly, GenSight is a gene therapy company that focuses on retinal disorders, and our first product, which is about to complete the recruitment in phase 3, is addressing a rare disease of the retina, which is called Leber hereditary optic neuropathy. And this is a fairly devastating disease that happens in people that are in between 15 and 35 years. And they would lose sight in their two eyes in a matter of a few weeks, 1 to 3 weeks, to less than a year. So in 1 year, 97% of these patients are going from normal vision like you and me to complete blindness. So it is in a sort of an emergency approach. So it's slightly different from others where you may have some time to intervene. Here, as the sooner you intervene, the better would be the outcome for the patient. So we very early on we looked at the reimbursement issue and the pricing issues with different tools. The first one was we launched a study to understand what is the cost of blindness, because there was various data all over the place in US, in Europe, direct costs, indirect costs, which I'm a scientist, but I didn't understand this. And we came to the point that we were able to have an evaluation that was consistent between the US and Europe, including 3 type of costs. I mean, the direct medical costs, which are essentially for blind people, accidents, because they're prone to more accidents, treating depressive status, because they came to this, and also the assistance, because they need permanent assistance to do the daily task. And we came to a cost, an annual cost, which is around 60,000 euro, and in the US was 65,000 US. So it's not really very different. And then, okay, that was a basis to compare or to plan for discussion with payers. And then we launched another study to go and see payers, both in the US and in Europe, to try to understand how they would behave with such approach. So very different result between US and Europe. In US, most of the payers that we met were essentially saying exactly what you say. I mean, well, it's a rare disorder, so having a payment that will be linked to efficacy year after year, I don't want this, because if I'm really lucky, 1 year I will have 0 in my customers. Maybe a bad year would have 1 or 2. So whatever is the price, whatever the price, not exactly true, but I'll pay the price, 1 shot and done. In Europe, it's very different. All payers in Europe, UK, France, Germany, we didn't get anywhere else. They were considering a yearly payment, maybe an upfront for the treatment that could be in the range of maybe 100, 150, and then yearly installment until it ceased to be efficacious. Or, and that was fun because it was not the UK, it was not the UK, it was in France, and they say, yes, but we may just cap this. So even if it's 20 years efficient, after 10 years, we're not going to pay anything. So that's fine. And then when it boils down to what would be the pricing, they consider the yearly cost of a blind people, and then it comes to how efficient is the treatment, because it can be, okay, you give back some autonomy to the patient, or you give back vision, which is slightly different in terms of the cost. And then we discussed with them, they don't want to look at the cost of the current existing orphan drugs, because you multiply 200,000, 300,000 by 10 years or 20 years, you get to millions of euros, and that's not palatable. And then we were able to convince them that if they look at transplantation, they have something that is similar in terms of we are replacing a lost function. It is going to be for a long period of time. Transplantation is for lifelong, but maybe it's reduced life, and you need to have immunosuppression. But notwithstanding the immunosuppression, it's really for a one shot for long. And then you get to pricing that are in between, depending on the transplantation, in between 400, 500,000 to slightly above $1 million. And then with this, I think we got a consensus with the payers. In the US, they would accept to pay for this to pay this price one shot. Okay. In Europe, they would agree to get to this pricing, but in several installments that could take 10 years. Things may so in Europe, we all understand here that Europe is a very centralized system. I mean, it's national bodies that are reimbursing, so it's probably easy for those organisms to pay by yearly installments. In the US, because there are private insurers and patients are changing insurance from, I think, every second or 3 years, that's probably more cumbersome for them to organize, and more complex for them to organize, to make sure that they are not going to receive more patients that are going to require an immediate payment of maybe 50,000 or 100,000, I don't know. So it's very different. It may change in the US with probably some form of consolidation of the payers that has started already in the US. So it may change, but at the moment, I think I would consider that in the US they would pay one shot.
Is that your experience?
That's consistent with what we've heard too. So for the exact reasons you discussed.
So if all these drugs come through at $1 million,
but by the way, that might be very different when gene therapy will come to address chronic disease with a very large number of patients. That is going to be very different, and pricing obviously will have to be very different.
Yeah, sure. One of the challenges in the U.S. is that people switch systems. So you're expecting another payer system to inherit the cost of a previous treatment, and they say, well, how do you value that?
Yeah.
Right.
I think where we are now with the types of therapies that we have available, that we're targeting very seldom administration, very, very rare diseases, I think we can get away with going to the reimbursement agencies and saying, right, just pay for it, as they've said in the States. And I must say, we've had a lot of, before we launched Strimvelis, we had a lot of these discussions with many of these payers, and it was very much along the same lines. Even in Europe, where they said they're very interested in all of these amortization of payments, maybe payment every year, payment by some form of result. One of the challenge becomes is they don't have the infrastructure in place yet to be able to do an annualized payment. So I think it's also up to some of the payment authorities to be able to put these in place, because when you're paying for ones and twos of patients at large amounts of money, I think that's reasonable. Most of the health funds can absorb that kind of money, but what happens when we get to the more common indications and you're treating tens, 20s, hundreds, thousands of patients, that the system will not bear those kinds of charges. And I think us as an industry, it's our responsibility also to think about that and what can we do to help limit those costs as much as possible, so that these types of therapies in this whole field has some longevity to it, and we can actually move forward to being able to treat heart diseases, much more common chronic diseases, and still be able to get paid appropriately for them. Now, at not using an autologous therapy as we do today with incredibly high development and manufacturing costs, that's not possible. But we need to really challenge ourselves and think how we can get those prices down, make them more affordable. I think one of the other things we need to be thinking about is, these are all problems that we're having and therapies that we're having of the first world. What about the third world? What about Africa, India, the countries that don't have lots and lots of money? They can't afford these therapies. And it's our responsibility to figure out how we can make sure that we are able to get these therapies to these patients so that it's fair and equitable.
Interesting. Silvia, you like?
Yeah, I just think that is a bit risky to try to rationalize the coverage reimbursement of gene therapy on the saving of the related cost of management, because the moment, if you think longitudinally, then a patient that was supposed to die at age 18 after an enormous amount of cost for managing the disease will become a person healthy or very much improved, and most likely will marry and have children, and so you will have even more patients affected by the disease because the reproduction will still transmit the disease. It's true.
To be fair,
but longitudinal is an important consideration.
Conventional HTA would take that into account, though. It would add in the cost of the extended life of the patient. But Bernard, did you
No.
Patient?
I mean, I can tend to agree. I mean, but the extreme of this is that you may better have the patient die rapidly because it's not going to cost much. But I think we're not yet there.
This is not an ethical panel. I mean, they're very ethical people, and we're not going to examine that question right now because it's
But it's true that the issue has been made that sudden death is a cheaper way of dying than chronic heart failure. So
thankfully, a lot of the European health technology assessments take that into account and have mechanisms to pay for extended life. Nicolas, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just to build on the discussion between Tim and others and Sven about the sort of arrangements you need to define for payers. So it's one thing to bring to a US payer a transformative treatment for ADA SCID at a price of $500,000 or $1 million. It's another thing to bring a treatment for sickle cell disease, right? And you may actually be forced into pay-for-performance discussions. And I think that illustrates the need for us as companies to sort of prepare for various scenarios. We may come up with the perfect proposal, but actually we may find out in negotiations with payers that they're not ready for it, or they would like things to be done another way. And I think it's perhaps a good idea to think about pharmacoeconomics in some indications, such as San Felipe, where the unmet need is just so glaring. I think you have a very strong argument with a very strong clinical efficacy package. But in the UK, you may have to go to an HSD assessment through NICE, and you're going to have to produce a pharmacoeconomic dossier.
I would have thought you'd have that with any payer, but we're close to moving on from the subject. Are there any points from the floor?
Just a quick comment. So on the issue about the primary insurers not being prepared to pay because of the issue of your client moving on to another primary insurer, I thought about this a couple of years ago and went to the reinsurance industry. And if you think about it, for many primary insurers, they receive a percentage of their risk up to the reinsurance. And it tends to be outliers, i.e. the most expensive treatments, for example. So that's one comment. And the second comment is really what I think we need to be really careful and think about. These products will be reimbursable, but the challenge is understanding the risk linked with the timing of the cash flow. And it's not about saying, okay, well, these things, are they cost effective? Yes, but they're cost effective over a long period of time. And the question is, where is the risk attributed to the payments strategy that needs to be set up for that? And just one more plug for the reinsurance. I've actually just joined the reinsurance on a part-time basis exactly to address these types of issues. There is a subscription-based type products already. If you start thinking outside medical insurance, so there are plenty of other types of insurance products which are subscription-based.
So just to
There's infrastructure for a lot of these things.
you had a question there? Go on.
Well, I have questions around the word longevity. Cost effective over a longer period of time. But in fact, what is the clinical evidence for gene expression? How far do we know that a specific gene that's been applied to an individual will?
Which is at the heart of the risk question associated with these medicines.
Which at the time we don't know.
And the price will have to take into account some of that risk, and it will be discounted because the knowledge is not there. Just to reassure Sven a little bit and then everybody, with respect to the sort of next wave, and one of the big tasks that we at the Cell Therapy Catapult will be taking on over the course of the next 5 or 6 years is engaging in that discussion between industry, the payers, and the manufacturers and ourselves about and the healthcare system itself. Can we devise mechanisms that will work effectively and practically to have these long-term measures of whether or not the product is actually efficacious? Can you keep tracking the patients? There's a big role for the patient groups in that, because actually they're the ones in rare diseases who really know where all the patients are.
So I think that's just a phenomenal point, because what we're seeing at the moment. So we have Stromvelis approved. It has reimbursement. It's moving forward. But one of the challenges was being able to say, how long does this work? And I think it's more than just being able to show that the gene is in the cell and it's active. It's what is the clinical outcome Are you still making a difference to that patient's life? And this is a very difficult discussion to have. If you think of most of these studies that we're doing, that we purport to have a lifetime of outcome or a lifetime of resolution of symptoms, or even, sometimes we talk about a cure. We've often only got 2, 3, 4, 5 years worth of data to be able to show that. I mean, we were fortunate we had up to, I think it was 15 or 16 years, but it's only in 1s and 2s of patients. And that becomes a very difficult discussion to have with a reimbursement agency where they're building models around lifetime. And so I think we need to find a way to bring that discounting in, but in such a way that the company is still encouraged to invest in developing these products. And it has to be a two-way conversation. But I think this is where it comes in, where we were talking earlier about having appropriate surrogates that will give us a really solid idea of the long-term efficacy, how we're looking at it. And then also in certain of these diseases that are multifactorial, that have slow onset of changes, and we need to find ways that are fairly easy to look at, because the patients don't want to come back regularly for major bone scans or invasive tests on an annual basis just to see if the product should be paid for. So we need to be thinking about how we track these therapies and the outcomes of the therapies.
Great, thanks. Right, I need to move on. I've got my timer being worried at me, but we're on good time. So winding up now in terms of moving on, looking on beyond what's going on today and into the future, there's a whole waves and waves of new technologies coming through. What does the future look like? Tim, you've agreed to take this on. You want to tell us a little bit about your company and then discuss the subject of what future gene therapies will be like?
Well, I'm sure everybody, I hope, heard what Abeona does, but right now we're talking about the difference between gene replacement strategies. It's the current. The future is gene editing strategies, right? That are to get to your point, more permanent. I mean, GSK had a great regulatory package that went in. Long-term survival data, long-term safety data. You're going to have to show that same type of thing with the next wave of gene editing, right? And, David alluded to it earlier as well about the next generation of gene therapy vectors, from promoters to capsids. Many of the companies are trying to find, new capsid libraries to address different, being able to redose, to be able to show longer-term benefit, to show more specific tissue targeting. I think that's where things are going. And really, to answer your question, earlier, about gene expression, that's where some of David's technology is going to come in. But you really get into the nuances of gene therapy when you start talking about vector serotype, lentivirus versus AAV, whether you're driving it with a CMV promoter or a chicken beta-actin promoter. I mean, you're seeing, that longevity of expression is going to be very product-specific. That's going to come back to the reimbursement discussion as well. But from a next generation, right now we're just trying to get our arms around gene replacement strategies. The next thing is going to be gene editing, and Sangamo is trying to lead the front on that with some of their gene editing strategies, and certainly with CRISPR and Intellia and Editas, all certainly in the news these days about their technologies. But I'd kind of leave it at that and say.
So my question to the panel would be, do you think that's going to be part of your role? Are you going to be involved in the next generation of gene editing therapies, or is there going to be other players that have come forward and do that? Are you preparing yourselves now to move into that space as and when the timing comes?
I can only do so much. One, but
Yeah.
I think it's also a disease-specific call. So gene editing or lentiviral gene delivery may have respective rationales for specific indications. I think it's an indication-driven decision. Which vector technology you select.
So if I can maybe take a step back and just tell everyone a little bit about my company. So I think most people realize GSK. We've taken a slightly different and very brave approach about looking at cell and gene therapy, as I've already mentioned. And we have two groups within the rare diseases, which we're focusing in ex vivo gene therapies primarily related to CD34 cures therapies at the moment. And we've also got a group that's working, has great collaborations in the immuno-oncology space. And so what we're really looking at doing is we're trying to look at this as almost like a toolbox. And so talking about gene editing technologies and other things, we're fortunate enough in that we're slightly larger. And so we can start developing and working with groups that offer all these different types of therapies, different types of gene editing, different ways of delivering genes, so that we don't get to the point where we're necessarily focused on one mechanism of delivery, one mechanism of editing genes. And I think to Nicolas's point, we need to have a toolbox to be able to address the different therapy that we want to go after. So we can't just use one hammer to knock in all of the screws and the nails and the rivets. We need the appropriate tools to be able to address those therapies, and that's really the way we're taking a look at it. So we look at what is the technology that we have access to and how can we make a difference from there. So it's a slightly different take on it.
Okay, good, thank you. I'm afraid we're running short of time. I'll just summarise in terms of what I think we've heard today. Now, we've heard that there's an industry there which is, it's focused in a particular area at the moment, but there are directions it can go in terms of growth, in terms of going into other diseases and more common diseases, but also in terms of going into new technologies. We've heard that the clinical side of things is progressing. Actually, we haven't heard major problems. In other sectors, sometimes you hear of major problems in that area. We've heard about the things that need to happen in parallel, and that has brought out the question of the manufacturing capacity as much as anything, and that capacity is not necessarily a trivial problem to solve. We've heard about the payment question, and actually quite promising news from my point of view about the payment question in terms of there being a more immediate acceptability than perhaps some people perceive. And we've heard that there are new technologies coming down the line, so I think this industry's got a long way to go, and I'd like to say thank you very much to the panel for their very interesting inputs. Thank you.
Avengers is